Hello and welcome to another episode of the JUXTCast with me, Jeremy Taylor, Malcolm Sparks, and today's guest is Ryan Robitaille. Ryan, we spoke back in, I think it was January or February this year. I messaged you because I was aware, as someone in the Clojure universe, that you were someone with strong opinions about SQL. And Malcolm and I thought it would be great to have you on the JUXTCast to hear about your experiences in data and the tooling that you've been building called Rabbit. And maybe just kick off, Ryan, with a little bit of introduction to yourself and your vision for Rabbit.
Yeah. So thanks for having me. It's been a very long, strange trip for me. I have a very non-traditional kind of background. So to kind of understand some of the Rabbit stuff, I might have to go back and kind of talk about, how I cultivated this set of beliefs, you could say, about how data and visualization, how things should kind of work, or at least how I feel it. So, you dropped out of college, ended up getting a contracting job doing like solutions engineering for a small like IT company. And what's cool about that is that you get thrust into all kinds of things. Like, my first few months there, I was sent to a state police contract, working on Oracle systems, and I'm like 19. And, previous to that, I'd been a mechanic for a Volkswagen dealership. I just did programming stuff on the side and pretty much crazy switch to that, right? Working with your hands and then being like, oh, here's a bunch more money and solve these more abstract problems. Like, okay, cool. But, it's back then, the Oracle stuff and reporting stuff was always kind of part of the thing. But a great thing about that kind of quote unquote education is that it's all trial by fire, right? You're all like, hey, we need to solve this problem now. We don't care how it's done. We just need the answer. And, there's some good and bad to come out of that, but it learns, you learn to adapt and pivot pretty quick, right? So did that for a while. Lots of data eng stuff, ended up building, data warehouses for a lot of different places. I was in Baltimore for a while working with the energy companies there, a whole bunch of clients, GE, blah, 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 blah. But, data warehousing, OLAP, SQL Server analysis services for a while. But I've always kind of been like a artistic, like creative guy. Like I wanted to be an illustrator for the longest time. And that's kind of what I almost went to school for. Always did it on the side. So I always had this kind of weird, like, mind for things. So one day I got introduced to, so I'd always was building like little dashboard tools for clients. Just because we needed it, right? Because back then the landscape of proprietary tools wasn't quite as robust as it was now. We're talking like early 2000s. You had reporting services or business objects, and they're either really expensive enterprise tools or they're kind of like fiddly. And, I was like, well, hey, I can just write like some Python and some JavaScript or use like, what was the name of that library that was everywhere back in the day? The JavaScript library.
jQuery.
jQuery, yes. I was gonna, yes.
Yeah.
Like, hey, I can just take some Python and some jQuery and like make this little like dashboard app and whatever. And people are like, oh, this is cool. And I was like, oh, this is kind of interesting, right? Because it's more of a visual thing that I'm doing besides just like, hey, here's a bunch of like SQL queries, which is cool, but not quite sexy, right? And it makes it, you're selling data warehouse projects, and it's kind of like, here's your star schema. It's like people aren't exactly like, wow, amazing. But if you have some charts and stuff, okay, all of a sudden they can kind of like see, So then one day I was introduced to Tableau, and this is early in the Tableau days. And it really kind of spoke to me as both a data guy and as like an artistic guy. I was like, oh, crap. Like, okay, so I can actually build stuff that's actually really nice and put some kind of artistry in it and, sell that, you sell, quote unquote, as part of a contracting outfit, on these jobs. And they'll be like, oh, wow, that's great. It's like a whole interactive, suite of dashboards that does stuff. And it was almost like, to me, like the Photoshop at the time, right, of building charts, right? I felt like it's very expressive. I can do this, try that. It was a big shift for me. So I started doing a lot more dashboard type stuff and a lot of Tableau stuff. And I started blogging about it. And I'm kind of a weird dude, so I was doing like dashboards on like Metallica show dates and like Bigfoot sightings and that kind of stuff. And this is before I mean, not to toot my own horn here, but this is before that became a whole lot of a thing. You know what I mean? There was like, what do you call it? Like, infographics and stuff, but it wasn't until a few years later that became the big deal, where it's like, hey, like I've visualized all the Harry Potter plot lines. Like you didn't see stuff like that back in the day. So me doing like Metallica Viz and posting it on my blog for Tableau stuff and doing like, all kinds of weird stuff was a bit of a novelty. Right. And I say that because it got some eyeballs, and then my career slowly turned more into like Tableau stuff. And then leading me to, get an interview at Facebook. And then, I left New York, went to work for Facebook. And then, things kind of snowballed there. So I bring it up because it's like career-wise, it was definitely a launching pad. I mean, unfortunately, I don't think Tableau has done a whole lot. They haven't made that paradigm shift from where it was in the beginning, so I have some criticism of them, but I definitely owe them a lot in getting me, from where I was to where I am now, I suppose. Right. So gets me out to Facebook, doing Tableau stuff, doing data engineering stuff, Python, SQL. And me being me, I was frustrated with the tools we had at Facebook for business intelligence. They had Tableau, and Tableau's great, but there's very much a schism there between like data engineering culture and SWE culture. Right. And the Swedes just want to build everything from scratch. And, the BI people are more like pragmatic. And I say that not to disrespect the Swedes, but just like they just want to get stuff done, right? They don't care if it's in Tableau or MicroStrategy. They just need to publish out a thing, even though it's not a pure engineering play. It's proprietary.
Landmine. SWE is Facebook's software engineering
programmers. Yeah, apologies.
Right, okay.
Yeah, like data engineers versus software engineers.
Right.
And, it's a kind of push and pull. You see it a lot of places. You have these tools, depending on how mature the company is, you'll have these tools that are expensive and work well, but they have their limits. And then they have people that just want to write everything in-house, and that's cool as well. But that also, takes longer. It's more expensive in some ways, maintenance, whatnot. So you always see that. But my biggest problem was I wanted both, right? Like I didn't want to have to go to the React guys and be fighting them like, oh, we should just do this, because the requirements for this dashboard are as of such, it should be a whole, application project instead of a Tableau project or a MicroStrategy project. These things became so like divided. So my big thing is what I wanted is I built a proof of concept, of what I called Rabbit at the time, honestly. Now we're talking like, 2014-ish, because I wanted a tool that could do Tableau-like stuff, but also live coding and also checked into source control. And it had kind of trying to bridge those two worlds, right? Like with the easy things are easy, with user actions, but the hard things are still possible because we still have our foot in that world. And the project, I was a manager, ran that project for a couple of years, and we did okay, but it's like you shouldn't have competing, tools in your company with competing teams working on the same, working for the same thing. It just became kind of a weird thing. And I was in the BI group, and the other guys were in the SWE group, and it was like a duplication of effort, that didn't really need to exist. But anyways, I learned a lot going through, we did a lot of user studies, and that's kind of where the emphasis of a lot of this comes from, right? These ideas, like it was kind of like, I started to get this idea in my head of like, of all the things I've seen in my entire career, what would be the best platform for that kind of thing, in my mind, at least, to get the most wonderful, beautiful things possible, but not limit people either technically or like artistically. I know that sounds very highfalutin, right? But like, I wanted to make sure that there was like a low bar, but a high ceiling, right? If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does.
If you guys saw the video, you can tell that I'm shooting for a weird level of presentation that you don't see in a lot of tools.
Yeah, I mean, there is a gap, isn't there, between the what Swedes would build, the homegrown but infinitely extensible and customizable, and you just have to have a team of developers, and you just have a backlog of stuff, and you push them stuff, and then you have products where you do stuff in the product, but it feels proprietary. You don't have source code control, version control. You don't feel that there is a source code that you can, it's a black box and it's embedded in some database format which you don't own. So you feel almost disenfranchised from from your work because you don't have it in source code form. You can put in a version control. And there are those subtle differences where there is still this chasm between the stuff you buy and the stuff you can build. And it feels like there should be stuff filling up that chasm which allow you have the freedom to do both. There's definitely benefit in buying stuff. Products are kind of fantastic in a way because they reduce a huge amount of cost from an organization because they don't have to maintain. They don't have that. The cost of ownership is, in most cases, not all, but most cases should be lower than building it yourself. But there has got to be a whole class of products, and I think spreadsheets are a bit like this. Spreadsheets are in the middle because you kind of you get the spreadsheet software, and then you don't really need to buy new versions. You don't care. You're off to the races. You have a tool that you can then is almost infinitely customizable. Lotus Notes was another thing Jeremy and I talk about. There are these standout historic products that have managed to somehow unleash user creativity. I think MySpace as a platform did that, and there are other examples, but few and far between. So that's what I was reminded with when I saw your. Anyway, I know. Hand over to you. But I think you make a good point that there is.
That's awesome that you bring that up at Lotus Notes. Like that. That's really one of the things that I was thinking about because I started out on this journey. It's like, I want to build a better Tableau or better superset, right? But then to get all the things that I wanted, what I really need to create is like a Lotus Notes, a HyperCard. You know what I mean? It became that thing because in order to get to where I wanted to get, you can't just be one thing. It has to be a platform for presenting and composing things, right? Which isn't quite as niched as something like Tableau, which does a really good job, but can only do a certain amount of things. But the problem is when you scope out the things you're doing, it becomes monumentally more complicated, right? But you bring up a good point earlier about sometimes buying stuff is just good, right? You have a problem, your turnkey solution, and you get your reporting and whatever. And if you don't want to think about it too hard, people can just pay the $1 million a Tableau or whatever and get out of it what they need to, and that saves them a ton of time and money because they can just go right to market. Or like Excel, Excel is undoubtedly the greatest data tool ever invented. There are places that run their whole entire company on, a gigabyte size Excel files and link sheets and madness. But, hey, it is what it is, right? That works too. I've worked places that had, spreadsheets that they work on and then they save it and they go to lunch because it takes like an hour to save all this crazy nonsense. And they run their business that way, which is kind of crazy, but hey, it gets them by. But the whole like build it or buy it thing, was always a common thing, at least in business intelligence. And again, me being like an artistic, like kind of like weirdo, like I would always hit this wall or like, I want to do this, or maybe a customer says, hey, it'd be great if I just clicked that thing and this other thing happened. And you got to be like, well, I can't really do that, but I can do this other hack workaround as this other thing. Or maybe we can like send you out to like an iframe. There's, all kinds of hacky stuff to do. And I was like, I really would love if I had a tool that was more of like a, I say on the GitHub page, like a game engine for data, right? Like Unreal Engine, except it's about ingesting and outputting data that other people can, comprehend, right? Because as much as I love the technical stuff, if you're a dashboard guy or gal, your job is really to communicate information to other humans where they can just grok it really quickly and make a decision, right? Even if you're writing SQL, right? It doesn't matter where it came from or what it did. Like maybe you have a dashboard for the C-level people that is just a big red no, right? Like sometimes that is 100%, this is what the data says, right? That's kind of what you're communicating. It's not necessarily, it's become this kind of like, there's a lot of like fanciness to it, which is totally cool. But I think sometimes it just comes down to like, are you giving answers to people that need answers to go and make decisions, right? Almost like in like a military wartime sense, right? Like hey, we have this stuff happening with all the information on the ground. What is what is our best guess to go forward, right? Or what are we monitoring, or how are we doing today? Like, I think all that stuff exists in the same kind of world. And like, that's what dashboarding is to me, right? Like, what is happening? Let me process it. And then sometimes it's, what should we do? And that's kind of like what you're communicating. Again, a bit of an aside, right? But
so how did you get started with how did you get started on your kind of journey towards, so you mentioned that you're familiar with Clojure, so interesting to hear about that story, how you got into Lisp, because you were in Oracle, you're doing Tableau, you're doing a load of kind of data dashboards, but fast forward, how did you kind of begin to get into Lisp?
Yeah, so I had always been doing, JavaScript and Python and, the regular kind of stuff you would think for someone in my, job. But I saw one of Rich's talks. I think it was the Complect one, simple. Was it Simple and Easy?
Simple Made Easy.
Simple Made Easy. Yeah, yeah. And before I had ever heard of Clojure, and I saw it probably, I don't know, maybe I don't know when that talk was given, but we're talking like 2014. I don't know how old that talk is, but it was a while ago from now, right? And it always kind of stuck in my head because I'm building all these things, right? But in the back of my head, I always knew that like the things that I want to build are limited by the complexity that I have to manage, right? Like, and I'm a bit of a weird like thinker. I think kind of like more in like shapes and colors than like numbers and letters. And I know that sounds kind of esoteric, but like, we all have this little palette of what we can hold in our head at any given time and understand. I think that in addition to our platforms we're building on, limits or expands the kind of things we can create, right? Because if I can only hold in my head so much and I have to go and externally to like the whiteboard or graph paper, it slows you down, right? So I had this concept of like, oh, I can build more complicated things with less stuff. And then on top of that, the siren song of, hey, like, with the Clojure script story, I can use the same language and, not have to do the code switching back and forth or be producing strings in Python or whatever ugliness I was doing at the time, right? So it was kind of in the back of my head. I hadn't really jumped into it. And then one day I just started like building things, right? I mean, so the version of Rabbit you see is probably the 20th, prototype I made over the course of me learning what to do and what not to do, right? And figuring out, what was going on. Not only evolving the ideas I was trying to convey, but also like basically learning Clojure, like what works. And like, hey, I got to run a pedestal backend, and then I'm running Shadow CLJS, and like piece by piece, I kind of learned all this stuff slowly as I worked at various places, like I said, Facebook and Tesla and Airbnb, and always on the side, I was working on something. So like I said, like the ideas and the language. But the secret unlock for me with a system like this, which Rabbit in its current state is pretty much all about DSLs and rules, right? Like a rules engine with a DSL layer. So like HoneySQL plus Hiccup as a dashboard language, but it's also a code generator, right? So there's a lot of stuff going on. It resolves parameters from the server and the client. But long story short, a lot of that is only made possible because of Clojure being, code is data, data is code, right? It makes it very easily to say, hey, I have this whole system, and then I have this other stuff I want to resolve, and I can post walk the world, right? You know what I mean? I can post walk this whole thing. I can do that recursively. I can replace stuff, and then I can have pieces of my system be slowly built in Rabbit itself, which is the whole self-referential thing, which in other languages I think would be very complicated. But Clojure, that just is how we do business, right? Like everything is a map or a vector, and then whether it's being rendered or whether it's data, it doesn't mean it's the same thing. It's like all I have to do now is understand how to resolve that object and then render it, whether the render it means it's drawing a chart or a grid, or maybe just doing some EDN, or maybe I'm doing like nested blocks. Like it's just, everything is just another permutation of data that I'm presenting to the user. So coming back to my earlier dashboard thing, it's like, if Clojure is all about data and that's all we care about, okay, then the aim should be, how do I get the data to be seen in the most understandable way where the programmer or whatever can move on and do the next thing, right? If I'm looking at a nested structure, how can I visualize that so they can find their get in key path and move on to the job they're trying to do, right? Which maybe I want to take that parameter, put it into a SQL query, run that, create, some drop downs. Like all this basic stuff is basically just like, like I said, hypercard earlier, right? It's like creating little building blocks out of other building blocks that can build things that people can then use, right? The dashboards, the fancy data applications, I guess. So I think Clojure is very much a big part of that story, because like I said, I would not even attempt half this stuff in a language like Python or something. I'm sure it's possible with some, crazy methodology, but I mean, this is just what Clojure is and what it does. And the fact that you can write, so you can get so much more done with so much less code in addition to that. And then, not even getting into the meta part of it, right? Where I'm post walking lists and stuff, and like, having REPLs pull back, live examples. It wouldn't exist, without that for sure. And then it was like full on, I'm doing everything. I did the whole thing as, Clojure script and Clojure. All my logic is basically looks like honey SQL fragments, where they're like, where like honey SQL where clauses is like my logic engine, recursively, like, is this, I create like an attribute, like, is this a ClickHouse database? And then I use and ClickHouse database and is an integer. Like this is whole, like, no pun intended. There's this whole rabbit hole of things you can do when you have a recursively resolvable system, that then renders out to the UI. So I think I might have taken that question a bit aside, but very, very cool. And like I hope I never have to use other languages again for my career, for sure. That would be a bummer.
No, it's really, really great to hear your experience and sort of how you got into it. Because I came into Clojure for similar kinds of reasons, in a sense, sort of working on this ultimate project where almost the speed of developing on the project is what drove you to Clojure. But then the thing you want to deliver to your end users is also that similar sort of REPL experience, right? Where your users are essentially doing programming, right? Like when they're building these charts and things, they might not be writing the functions directly in the list, but like when they drag and drop widgets in your UI, they are putting together small programs, right? And it's this live dynamic system. I think that's really neat. And when you spoke about Rabbit a couple of years ago in the Reclojure conference, you described it as like a canvas of REPL blocks, and I think that's also a really useful model, especially for people that are interested in Clojure. But your experiences with tools like Tableau, and I must confess I haven't used BI dashboarding tools extensively, certainly going to be nothing like your experiences. What does it look like when you hit the limits of the end user programmability of those tools? Like, do you have to just wait for support tickets and hope and pray that the product managers add the feature you need, or do you think the extensibility is actually a really important part of the entire proposition?
Well, they've added some JavaScript and some things, like some bolt-on things to do more custom stuff, which is cool. And I haven't dug into that world, so I could be speaking out of turn here, but it just felt like you can get some cool stuff done in Tableau. That's the one thing that I really liked about Tableau initially, is that yes, it had this system of rules and formulas, but it still was a hackable system. You could get stuff to work in weird and like messed up ways. And I think that's for any kind of system that like pushes like this emergent behavior, I think that's super important, right? So yeah, you can do a lot of cool things, but you hit your limits. And then even if you're like, even the rock star Tableau people that are building crazy, crazy shit, right? They're basically writing esoteric formulas in a proprietary system that are, you know what I mean? Like you are so pigeonholed in the specificness of what you're doing. It makes you think like, wow, like I'm really good at this one very narrow thing, but it doesn't necessarily relate to anything else outside of the world, right? And that's something that always worried me when I was a consultant. So I would know these guys doing like, Oracle, FP&L stuff and all this like deep application knowledge, and they're making tons of money. But I would think to myself like, yo, dude, if that app like is gone next year and some new thing from SAP or whatever comes out, like you're boned. You know what I mean? Like you're not boned, but you know what I mean? Like you put so much into such a deep niche. And like I kind of felt Tableau is getting kind of like that. Again, this is like another aside, but you can go pretty deep, but it's an esoteric thing. And I thought if I want a tool that is like you brought up with the blocks of REPLs, like everything in Rabbit is generating code that you can then tweak, right? There's no black boxes, there's no magic wizards. It generates code that you can then change. So everything is still code, even if I have a fancy thing on top of it. That's what I like, because if you're looking at the code, like it's Recom and Hiccup and Honey SQL, like there's some Rabbit specific stuff, but you're still learning stuff that is useful outside of this world, and I really kind of like that in terms of like learning stuff, especially with a tool that's so visual. Like, let's say I know nothing about recharts, right? But I use Rabbit. I make a rechart bar chart. I really don't know what's going on, but then I go into code mode and I go into scrubber mode, and now I'm scrubbing the values and the colors to get it the way I want. And not only am I customizing it in an easy way, but I can see the code that I'm changing, right? I can see, hey, if I flip this to that. And I think it makes people more comfortable with code because they're actually manipulating the real thing, as opposed to me having like some abstracted scaffolding of our recharts object that is only editable. You know what I mean? Like, no, you're actually editing the actual vectors and maps inside this object, and I'm showing that to you. Seems like a small thing, but I think that mental model connection to things is super important. It kind of goes into like I don't know if you're familiar with the Brett Victor, the UI work, which was super influential to me, years ago. I'm surprised it hasn't gotten as far into the industry as I would have liked, with things like this, with like direct manipulation, like seeing what you're doing, and this beautiful orchestral dance between easy, kinesthetic movements with code. And like, that's kind of at the base of what I'm trying to do, like this ladder of abstraction, like, hey, like Joe just wants to make a dashboard. Great. Okay. And Susie wants to make a dashboard. She wants to write it all using like tablecloth and then output it with like, Encanter JPEGs. Like, cool. Like they should be able to live in the same world and possibly work on the same dashboard. Like that's where I think that the kind of magic is, with like a canvas of REPLs. It's like Rabbit's almost like a deconstructed notebook, like a non-linear deconstructed notebook. Everything, it relates to each other, but it's not bound by that linear flow, right? It's things that reference each other in more of a non-linear plane kind of thing.
Maybe more of a relational way, you might say.
You might say relational, yeah.
Yeah.
That's the great thing.
So, yeah.
That's the great thing about, the post-walk the world things, right? Is I know everything is connected to everything else. And if you're a subquery, I know that you're downstream of this query and upstream of that query, and you can make a whole lot of interesting things that way, and keep the lineage. If I have a select all, and then I drag out a group by, or I drag out a count, well, that group by and that count is just doing a subquery on the first query. So in terms of lineage and stuff, like I could render all that in the UI, and like people know that, hey, if I filter this upstream, or if I filter this upstream query, it's going to cascade to all these downstream objects. And like, that's the kind of stuff you want, making crazy dashboards. But it's another thing that's kind of hard to communicate in a product like Tableau, which basically has a configuration, a bunch of drop downs for deciding what talks to what. And it really isn't, I really like flow-based tools because, again, maybe it comes back to more of my like weird mind, the way I see things. I like to be able to see it, like, this thing flows into that thing and then it goes into this other thing. It gives me the kind of lineage in like a better way, right? I see SQL that way too. I see SQL as kind of like, as weird as this is going to sound, I see SQL as more of like shapes and blocks and colors, right? Like, and that's another thing that I always thought was very similar to Clojure in a weird way, because I thought that SQL to me is building from the inside out, because you start with larger things and then pare them down as the code goes out, talking about like subqueries. And Clojure, I feel, is very much the same way, because if I look at a SQL query, I'm mentally unpacking the inner part, the outer part, you know what I mean? I'm doing my paren parsing. I mean, before I even knew Clojure or Lisp, That's just how I would look at it. So I see those two things actually being very similar conceptually to me. But yeah, kind of a weird thing, but I don't know. I don't know if I'm alone in that, but they feel that there's a kinship there somewhere.
I gave a talk at Heart of Clojure on the relationships or the overlaps and in all the things Clojure and SQL have in common, and maybe I missed one off my list with that. But I do think there's more parallels than most people would see on first inspection. Like the syntax is completely different. But yeah, I feel like that's a good segue into talking about your views on SQL specifically, because when I got in touch, it was because we were working on this sort of post data log language for XDDB, XDQL, and I really just wanted your opinion as someone that knew SQL, knew Clojure, probably knew data log as well. But yeah, when you sort of show Rabbit and the way you're able to, without even observing any SQL that's being generated, like just probe the different relations, do joins, do your aggregations intuitively without having to type any SQL. I think that's quite an amazing achievement, and it demonstrates that actually you can generate SQL. And obviously, you mentioned the library Honey SQL by Sean Caulfield, which has been really key to your ability to do that. But how do you find the SQL as a language? I mean, what was your journey with SQL itself, and what's your view on it these days?
So I love SQL. I definitely, it's one of the earliest things I got deep into just because the kind of work I was doing, back in the day. Like I mentioned, Oracle databases back in the state of New York, has all kinds of Oracle machines and mainframes, and there's a lot of stuff there. So a lot of the early stuff was Oracle and SQL Server. And then I did some Python, but I've been doing SQL my entire career. And I maybe I like it just because I'm just so used to it, There's other stuff like, SPSS and some statistical stuff, but it almost always came down to SQL. So I don't know if it's a familiarity bias, or what it is, but I just like it. To me, it's like the de facto way of like considering a tabular data structure, right? And things have gotten a little bit murky, with the JSON, the nested, and we've kind of like done some blending there in some ways. But at the end of the day, it's still kind of, tables and columns and rows, and that's kind of like, especially if you go back to my Tetris analogy of looking at, data structures. Yeah, I love SQL. I mean, there is some people that probably would have built Rabbit, using, data log, right? And that's pretty hot right now, right? Is everything is data log. And I think data log is cool too, but there's something about SQL that I find more expressive, even though it's a bit more verbose, and plus, as you guys, it's the de facto language in the industry, and it's not going away anytime soon, no matter how many Hacker News posts say they've fixed SQL, right, or reinvented SQL. Like it's just not going to be a thing. Maybe that's me as an old guy talking, but I see that, I'm just like, oh geez, like these people that invented the SQL alternative, it's like, have you ever used SQL? Like, come on, man, like we can do this. We can do this on a server. You don't have to run 10 gigs of pandas on your laptop, man. But anyways,
yeah.
Spicy.
Well, I think the main critique we have of SQL is having to build it as a database implementer. I think as a user, it's not so bad, but if you're trying to build a parser, it gets pretty hairy.
Oh yeah, if you're trying to build a parser, you're in hell, right? Because it's a string and the spec is all over the place, and everyone has their own little dialects, and from that perspective, it's a mess, right? Just to put it nicely, right? So yeah, I mean, having to parse it. And that's why Honey SQL is so, great, because I can programmatically, create it. I wish there was a better way to go back from string to Honey, right? But then that's the parsing problem, right? So being able to programmatically create it and then materialize it out to strings, very cool. But yeah, I do wish there was a bit more. It was a bit more bi-directional, right? But once you bake that SQL string, you're kind of stuck. And even some of the best SQL parsers I've seen struggle because it's boundless, right? The types of syntax and stuff that you'll see in SQL based on the different dialects, and there used to be there's a standard, but is anybody really follow it? Everyone has their own special things, and that's awesome. But especially for someone like me who's building a tool that wants to use any JDBC database, becomes really tricky because they handle things differently, and even referencing tables and columns, and everyone does it differently. And God forbid I want to do like a substring or this and that. Like it's different depending on what database you're in. And it kind of brings into some of the design challenges that I've recently been dealing with Rabbit is that, so you mentioned earlier, it's really cool to have like, drag and drop to create SQL and mutate SQL. And there's been tools to do that, forever, like, rows and or like dimensions and measures is a very common like pivot table thing. But there's so much stuff out there. And like in me trying to mix Clojure and SQL, I had to kind of take a step back and basically say, okay, instead of it being me hard coding all these cool SQL things, like I'm going to build a rules engine. And the rules engine is going to say, for this object that you're dragging has these attributes, and these other objects on the screen have these attributes, whether it's code or whether it's, well, I guess it's all code, right? Because we're talking Clojure here, but whether it's like a list or whether it's like a SQL query. And I basically had to have a rule set that says, okay, if you're dragging out an integer from this table, for the table itself, you could remove it, you could use it as a sort. If you drag it to a new place in the canvas, now you can make it a sum, you can make it an average, you can create a new query. So basically, I created rules for how all these things work. And then that goes into, it gives the user context options about what they have in their hands, so to speak, right? About what they can do with it. And how this comes back to the SQL question is that, well, this means I can write rules that say, hey, if you're using ClickHouse, I can give you a count distinct, right? Or a count approx or whatever, and it'd be a lot faster than, count distinct. Or if you're using this, like I have to use this different logic to split the dates because it doesn't work in this other database kind of thing. And it allows that kind of tweaking, which is laborious, but it's way better than like, hey, I can't wait until my database, or I can't wait until my dashboard tool supports esoteric feature Y from, cockroach 64 database, right? Like you don't have to do that. You can just write that in as a rule. Like, oh, if it's a cockroach database, you can use the cockroach function. Like, dope. I can just put that in my little vector EDN file, and then boom, now Rabbit has that ability. And I write the little function that mutates the inputs in the function. And now all my users who don't give a crap about any of that can just drag and drop and they get their, cockroach functions. But again, speaking to that, with databases that have really cool things, kind of like, I'm going to shine up XCDB here a little bit. Like, the time travel and the temporal fields is that, so now I can make creations where it say, okay, if I see the, valid time field and it's an XCDB database, when they drag out that group by, when they drag out that field, not only do I give them the regular options of SQL to have, group by this or count distinct or whatever, I can say, hey, because of my rules logic, this is a thing that has a special, functionality. And since I'm using Rabbit, which is, when I'm dragging and dropping things, I'm just creating new data structures, right? It's HoneySQL, it's Clojure code, it's vectors of hiccup and recom. I can drag this thing out and say, hey, instead of making a group by, why don't you create a slider with all the dates available and then send that back to the source query and say, hey, where valid time between this? So then now I've just created a UI scrubber for the date, right? That I can go back in time and look at and re-render essentially my whole dashboard. If I did this to a top level, query, re-render my whole dashboard to that time and space and see all my metrics change. Like it's stuff like that where it's like really cool because now we can use all the information we have to generate not just more data, but views and artifacts of that data. And I think that's the kind of stuff that's like really kind of exciting because you could take that a whole bunch of different ways, right? Like the ability to generate compound objects on simple inputs, I think is dope because your advanced Clojure people or Rabbit people can create these constructs. And then regular users can, use them. It's kind of like, how do you bridge between having an expert tool and having a tool that someone can just pick up and use? And like, I think having that user space programmability, right? And programmability that isn't like, hey, download our repo and then you can fork it. It's like, yeah, no one's gonna do that. they just want something they can take a flag and have a thing work, or they can like type in some stuff and have it work. And no offense to people who want to like fork stuff, mazel tov, go for it. But for that kind of program, I talked about the Tableau hacking, right? Like I want to be able to enable hacking at every level, because I think that's how the coolest stuff gets built. People that can like go outside the bound, color outside the lines and do stuff you never wanted. And I think that's kind of like the hallmark of a great tool, is that people can use it in a way where you were like, wow, like that's insane. Like, and Tableau was that for the longest time. And like I want Rabbit to kind of like be that. It's like, hey, I have a canvas with a bunch of REPLs on it, with a bunch of queries on it, which, by the way, was an initial use case. As a data engineer, sometimes I'd sit here with all my monitors, and my job is to monitor a bunch of metrics and a bunch of tables and make sure the database isn't crapping out. So I'd have IDEs open everywhere with different SQL queries and maybe a dashboard here and there. But with Rabbit, I was like, hey, I just want to have a canvas that I have this query, I have this aggregate, I have this thing, I have this little case statement that says whether something's good or bad. And I just look at that all day, right? It runs, they refresh every 2 minutes or whatever. And that was like a really initial use case, like a data board, right? And it 100% does that today. And you add in the REPL aspect where it's like, hey, when this thing changes, run this Clojure code and show me, that the value is 6. Like, that's the kind of stuff that like it really kind of like came from. And I think, hackability, you really need that in those kind of tools, because otherwise you're building like click next on a wizard, right? Which is fine, but you're never going to get super cool output that way. You're never going to get emergent, how do you put it? Emergent gameplay, right? Out of black box wizards, unfortunately.
That's an amazing sort of vision. And Malcolm, I feel like we've had a conversation about something like this. You saw built in Erlang. Am I imagining that? Maybe we discussed it in a JUXTCast previously.
Yeah, actually, I think I know the JUXTCast. I looked it up whilst Ryan was speaking. I think it's the season 3, episode 2. We talked about user empowerment, but it was about again, this thread of you build enough of a platform and then users pick it up and then they build incredible things. I mean, Emacs, for example, is, I don't know, I'm not really interested in how the C programmers that go onto Emacs, because I don't see it. I just build macros and play around with it, and I extend and configure Emacs the way I want it to be. And that's, and we were talking about, a system that I was kind of orbiting, kind of interested in at Deutsche Bank, which was written in Erlang, and it was all trade user interface. It was kind of reports. Somebody wanted to see their FX delta on a particular book, they would write a kind of query in Erlang, and but they would see the chart, and there was a kind of an icon that allowed them to turn the page over and then edit the code and then turn the page back and see that. Nice. It was very basic, but it was almost kind of every web page could be editable and you could change it. And so it allowed traders to build their own visualizations and to be able to see their risk and see, the trading the real estate. I mean, this is what, Rabbit is great for, that you've got all that real estate, but traders want to configure it in a particular way, come in the next day, and they may not change their trading screens. They've got 10 screens in front of them. They not change them. They're very, very particular about what visualizations is going on which screen, because they're looking around every day and they're seeing an enormous amount of information, and they don't set it up every day. They never turn off their laptops, or they always see the same stuff. But a trader might want to be able to, if you're trading in oil or you're trading in something exotic or something, you may want to be able to tweak that. And so that ability to take on the system, the dashboards that people are given to you, and then you endlessly improve and innovate, because that's what traders do. They find new opportunities in the market, and they innovate, and they find ways of visualizing information, and that gives them opportunities. They can see opportunity alpha and places where they can trade, which makes them kind of better than they're all competing with other traders for those kind of that sense of where the opportunities are in the market.
Yeah, and that's a great point, because if all things being equal, the subject matter experts will always make the best thing for what it is they're trying to do, right? If you take out the cruft of it, comes back to like what is quote unquote end user programming, right? If they could get what they wanted from a system, that's what they'll use, and they kind of, and this kind of goes back to my BI argument too. Is like a lot of like BI tools you'll see built by teams of software engineers that have never really worked in that space. You know what I mean? They never really had to deliver that kind of artifact to a user. And then they're building a lot of these tools. It's kind of like there's a disconnect there, right? Like with the subject matter experts, with the guys, watching the oil prices. If you're going to build an application for that, but you didn't know that world, like it might not serve it right, which is why I love the idea of, like, you kind of brought up the live coding, right? Like, oh, here's my thing, and I flip it over and I can hack on it and change it to what I want. Because I, as the guy who's just trying to get shit done, right, know better what I want than the person who's trying to, you know what I mean? Like, give me a technical solution for it,
Well, I know exactly what you mean. It's like, I can imagine when you give people the ability to, we might say, search the solution space with instant feedback, or another way of saying where they can play with the data, and a trader can say, well, what if we do this? And no trader is saying, what if I raise a Jira ticket for the development team to pick up in 6 months to deliver me another dashboard? Are you never going to innovate at that speed?
And they might not even understand the nuances, right, of the thing. It's like, I'm sorry to interrupt, but it's like, being a dashboard guy for so long, like, you go to people and you'd say, what do you, some team using something, some financial stuff that I don't understand, right, as an engineer, and be like, okay, what do you want? And they design something in Excel with like charts. I'm like, no, like, what information do you need to get out? Like, what questions are you trying to answer, right? And then we'll figure out what that is, as opposed to like, designing it in Excel. Like, it's this weird disconnect with, like I said, there are people that know the business and there are people that know the tech, right? Having those together is hard, but if we can lower the playing field to, like, allow people to build, and this is like, again, back to the hypercard thing, right? Like, how do you get power into people's hands where they can build stuff and solve their own problems,
Exactly. I've only really ever kind of written a few dashboards by hand, with Clojure script, and I was doing something on an IoT project where we were getting kind of air sensor data in, but what I remember about that project is that I had to, create my chart, or create my kind of, it was data streaming in, and then I tried, well, do I want it as a kind of a line graph, and it was moving, and I can't remember if, rolling averages, and it was just endless tweaks. It's, maybe that blue line, I need that line in blue. It's not thick enough. I'll need it a bit thick. Oh, that's too thick. I'll have it slightly thin. And it was constant iteration. And you couldn't imagine if every cycle was a Jira ticket that you had to raise. That would just never work. And so there is something profoundly different about being able to give the extensibility, the power into a subject matter expert to play with the data. And really, that eventually means that the developers don't get to change that much. They get to change the fundamentals, but they cannot change and I think our complaint about the whole kind of, I suppose, let's call it agile, but one of the things that we complain about agile is that it does tend to put all of the change and group all of the change into the team of developers. It's the team that is agile, not the system. The CI/CD process produces a beautiful crystalline structure, made of ice. And then if it's slightly wrong, don't worry, we have a factory that can produce another crystalline structure that's slightly different, like stop frame animation, right? And that is automation, but actually what you want to produce is plasticine, where the users can tweak it. You don't want to create an ice structure, because if a user tweaks an ice structure, it breaks, right? There's no wiggle room. There's no plasticity in the artifact that's being delivered.
Well, I think a lot of it culturally too, in engineering, comes down to this idea of control, right? Where in some aspects they feel the users are kind of like beneath them at a certain level, and like they don't want the users to do things that they think are like incorrect. So they create a rigid system with only certain buttons and shapes, because that's just how they were, brought up, as opposed to the idea of, like you're saying, like with making it plastic, like have a, what if we built a kind of like a DSL, like not to toot my own horn, but like kind of what Rabbit does, right? It's a code generator that runs in its own language, so you could write whatever you want, as opposed to me being like, okay, team, these are the 50 widgets we need to write, right? These widgets need these options. Like, you can do that, but like you said, it's a never-ending treadmill of making fragile things that will be broken in a minute. Where if you empower the users to say, or even the power users to create their own artifacts out of their own clay, and that then the other users can use. Like, I think that's a way more interesting system than trying to cover all the, I mean, part of the reason I do the configuration based system is that it's almost out of laziness, because I don't want to code 8,000 edge cases, right? I want a system that like we can add it to on the fly and not have to be like, oh, well, if it's MySQL, then do this. If it's that, then do this. Like, no, that is a rabbit hole you will never get to the bottom of, with that kind of stuff. And especially as users are concerned, like, oh, like, I want to do this thing. It's like, I never thought of that. Well, instead of never thinking of it, just build, it's almost like you're delivering like a micro programming language, right? Instead of a bunch of buttons and sliders for people. And it's way more complicated, but I think the long tail is way more interesting, right? Than endlessly building. You could build a much more polished system if you wrote all the widgets by hand and it was super nice and everything worked great, whatever. But would you be able to build as interesting and expressive artifacts out of it? And by artifacts, I mean, what the user consumes, what your end users are consuming. Like, I kind of doubt it, right? And it speaks back to your point of, what is plastic and what is ice, right? Something else I wanted to bring up real quick is that in this talk about, end user programming and building stuff, one of the things that I love that I tried to work into this tool, and there's a whole bunch of it really deep in the tool, but where I don't go into it, because your Rabbit's kind of like an iceberg. And I want to focus on the tip of the iceberg that people can understand and grok before I go into any of the other stuff, because it's just like, I realized that like, hey, I have my 20 years of information dumping into one tool is a bit much for people. But anyways, there's a lot of like flow-based programming stuff that is in the tool that I model things after. And I think that's another really cool end user programming thing. Like, so flow-based programming from the 70s, I think it was coined by John Paul Morrison, managed to get his past a few years ago. But it was basically at IBM, they wanted a way to basically use, boxes and lines to write their applications, black boxes that talk to other black boxes and send data. And I love that idea, because in my head, that's kind of how I see programs, what's talking to what and what loops back onto what. And I think it speaks really well to Clojure and SQL. And so there's a lot of that kind of thinking, which I think is very end user friendly, like flow based, because it's kind of like it's almost physicalizing the abstractions, of these functions in some ways. And I have a whole bunch of cool stuff in the application for that. But I think it's worth noting, because you have that end user programming, and then if you get them to program, let's say, a function in whatever DSL, or maybe they're connecting little widgets, and then you zoom out, I think like the flow chart is the next logical thing that you could get a normal person to say, hey, like we're programming here. You know what I mean? With while it's still a very valid, it's an AST tree, or it's a DAG, right? So something I think that's vastly underused, like in the spaces that I'm in, that I think we should be more. And if you've seen my videos and stuff, and especially the older stuff, like the really old Data Rabbit was all about flow-based programming. But then I realized that for a dashboard tool, I wanted to see if I could build a dashboard tool in just flow-based programming. And you can, but there's so much else and stuff needed there, it makes the presentation harder. So then with the newer Rabbits, I'm like, okay, I'm going to make a dashboarding tool. But surprise, I had to build the whole flow-based thing on the back end, because things need to work. And it's just like all these ideas kind of like, tumble around in the washing machine and end up coming up with something better. But again, the concepts stay the same. So I went way aside there with the flow-based programming stuff, but I think it definitely fits in the conversation to some extent.
I think eventually I can imagine you getting the Ivan Sutherland's like 1963 Sketchpad light pen demo going.
God, yeah, like the resolvers and the bridges and the bolt drawing. Oh, completely. Or maybe maybe I have PTSD from using like old school ETL tools with connecting boxes to move data, and that was always like burned in my brain.
I'm going to I'm going to try and create a criticism of data flow programming. And I feel there is something very beautifully tempting, and it accords very well with our experience as humans, because we see stuff there. You see liquids flowing into puddles, and you can pour water from. It accords very well with our experience of the world, that we see things moving in the world. We see things moving from place to place. In fact, we're completely geared up to move to, as hunters, we're very geared to seeing things moving from place to place, because that could be something that we can hunt. But I think that data in transit and data moving around from place to place is a more complex thing than data that is stopped, that is frozen in time. And so just the act of moving data from place to place in system to system, you introduce all kinds of concepts. You introduce a concept of time and delay and the latency between things and the ordering of events. And we often say introduce physics into maths. Introduce all these kind of, and I think that I mean, you can certainly program with that, but it feels like it just intuitively feels you've brought in a lot of complexity. So the model of event sourcing or XT, where the database is a value and then it changes with one change and it's another value, and you can go back to the previous value. Of course, you haven't lost that, but that. So I think there's a formal where we basically take out time from the system, because we say, well, the time just complicates everything. Going back, it just tracking things in different times and different places and different space times is just three-body problem. You get a lot of interactions and things. So we really have, with data, we have to just say at some point we got to stop the complexity, and we've got to say, right, where are we right now, and where are we going to be in the next frame, and where are we going to be in the next frame, just to reason about data. So I think that there's in summary, I think, it's awesome how quick you can create things at a simple level with these kind of flow concepts. But I think ultimately flow is a complicated, it brings in complexity, which we then have to mitigate and handle in. And we have to have strategies to handle in different ways.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a tipping point, and me experimenting with these systems for years now, it comes back to the visual programming thing, right? It makes some things easy, and especially things like data flow, it's easier to kind of grok what's going on, right? But unfortunately, it also kind of makes it more verbose to kind of understand at some point. Maybe it's just because, we're experts and we could look at a bunch of SQL and understand what it is, where if you had mapped that out on a canvas, it would take up a lot more space and it would be a little more difficult to understand. But the barrier of entry for people understanding it is lower. But for those of us who understand more things, it's like unzipping a thing that we can understand in the compressed format, right? Which is tough, right? Which makes me think that maybe the box and line thing is not the most efficient way to do that. Because I do think that you're right. I do think there is a way that visual programming and visual flows can be done in a way that is superior to 50-year-old text files, right? But I don't think we've really figured it out yet, right? Because there's not a great analog there, right? And the best we have is these, box and line charts and, using literal spatial things to show, abstractions and inheritance. And that's cool, but I think it only goes so far, to a point where, my older tool, was very flow based. You could zoom way out, have all this stuff. With the newer tool, I said, no, I'm not going to do zoom and pan, because there's only so much you can grok. And when you start doing zooming and panning, if it's a Figma design, that's one thing. But if you're trying to understand a whole system, zooming out and seeing 50 boxes and spaghetti everywhere, at some point you go backwards in your unpacking of complexity, right? Unless you adjunct it with things like, I can see it. I can see the hot path running, right? In those ways, it's superior to, code on paper, right? But yeah, I think there's a lot of work that needs to be kind of done there. I don't see anybody working on that, which is kind of crazy, because you'd think we'd be programming in VR by now, right? Putting shapes in holes and scrubbing vet parameters. I don't know, but you'd think we'd be somewhere. But no, we're still. And it goes back to the Brett Victor thing. It's why are we still using screens which are just paper, right? Everything's an abstraction of paper. And we haven't moved past paper. The whole thing is very interesting, but yeah, no, I'm with you. That's not even a defense of data flow programming. I think there's a very strong case to be made against it and for it, right? the things it does well and things it doesn't do well. But both of them have like their tipping point, their swinger limit. Like there's definitely a point there. But yeah, I'm on the pro side, but I totally see it, because do I write all my programs in those languages? No, I don't. I write them in text files, which is like, what does that mean, right? Like, if I was truly a dog fooder, right, I would build the system and write everything in that system. But anyway.
What's that computer game that everybody talks about? It's a sort of building game, but it's essentially
Factorio is a good one.
Yeah,
and then Minecraft is also like a programming language, spatial programming language. Like, that's the kind of stuff that I think is like, maybe that's the direction, right?
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, again, it's not that it's invalid as a programming thing. I'm just saying it doesn't scale, or it's inefficient to build something in with the red. What is it, iron ore or something in Minecraft, and build kind of.
But in some ways, that's very similar to having a bunch of boxes with lines connecting them together, right?
Yes.
It becomes like, at some level it's great, and then it becomes like unwieldy unless you're really good about black boxing things. And I had this whole idea at one point of like, okay, graphs within graphs, and then you kind of zoom into a more complicated graph, and it's inputs and outputs. And like, I don't know, at what point am I just better looking at the functions? And I'm saying that's heresy to like my whole vision of computing, right? But yeah, there's definitely a trade-off there, and I don't think we've found anything yet that is better, which is a shame, because like you said, our entire systems, our visual systems are built to process data in that way, right? Maybe a video game with abstract polymorphism with running animals and trees, we could process better than text files. But no one's creating complicated applications in abstract fairyland simulations. But you know what I mean, right? Like, it doesn't speak to like what our greatest strengths are mentally.
Yeah.
Well, bring you back to the dashboard thing. Ultimately, a dashboard is a 2D canvas, and you have to have some sense of hierarchy and use of the space. There's a psychologist, I think, called Barbara Tversky, who wrote all about and has been talking about this for years, about spatial thinking as being the foundation of thought, because the brain is ultimately just like a spatial processor. So all the thinking we do happens in space anyway. And if your dashboard, every time you turned up for work, was like changing every day, it would be horrendous. The most important thing is that it's stable. And the quickest way for it to be stable is for you to decide the layout. And the fastest way to do that is by dragging and dropping the components. And I think once you see, dragging the time slider from your table, for your XT table, you could put it on the side, put it at the bottom, to the left, to the top. But once you've made that decision, there is value in that being sort of frozen and sort of just knowing where that thing is. And I think it's like something we don't really appreciate as much when we approach programming from everything is just text point of view.
I mean, and rapid iteration is a part of it. And again, not to invalidate what I was saying before, but yeah, like in the small, I do think that kind of quote unquote programming is probably superior, but like there is that tipping point, as things get more complex. But yeah, for things like dashboards, it is 100% valid to do the whole thing visually, because what happens in dashboards is essentially just it's signals and triggers and events, essentially, right? I hit this drop down, it changes the SQL, it changes this query, which in turn is a subquery of this other query, and that changes like me able to see the lineage and the cascading events. Like, I think it's very well suited for that. And then whether those blocks in between are Clojure or Python or SQL, like, doesn't really matter, because you're orchestrating a thing. But like you said, the whole point of a dashboard is to communicate information with another human, right? So it should be pretty focused, on a certain thing, and this should get to that person, because at the end of the day, the user doesn't give a shit, what kind of paradigm you use to create it, or what kind of fancy ideology you have based on these things. They just want to know, like, hey, like, are sales up on the East region? And if so, if not, who can I fire? You know what I mean? Like, just like, that's kind of what they're trying to get out of it. So at the end of the day, like, all this goes to serve, as horrible as it sounds, it goes to serve like the business needs of the people that make the decisions, right? And I think sometimes we lose like sight of that. A crazy thing about, and then just as a quick aside, a crazy thing about dashboards that drives me nuts is that you go to a place and they make dashboards, and the most common dashboard you've seen is like, oh, it's got a bunch of graphs on it, and then they put like 40 filters on it. It's like, I see that and I'm like, the person who built this had no idea what it's going to be used for. So they're just throwing the kitchen sink at it and just hoping the user will figure it out, which is like, sometimes that's cool because you have like power users that know what's going on. But a lot of times that's just like, I don't know. That's just like totally lazy. It's like, did you ask this person what they need? Like, oh, but they might ask for this in the future. So I'm going to give them 30 things. Like, okay, well, then he's not going to use it for anything. Like, congrats.
Yeah, that's
Anyways,
the
a pet peeve.
Yeah, no, that's right. That's the kind of cassette radio things that you had in your car circa 1990s, where every single last acronym and feature could be packed in. If it was possible, they made it possible. And then, then we got the iPod and things where it was all about less is more. And you have less,
we almost
good design.
We almost went too far back.
Yeah.
But you look like I was going to say, like the old versions of Office with like 8,000 toolbars.
Oh, the ribbon. Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
It's like, what in the actual hell? Like, do they pay you guys per feature? Like, this is just not, this is not, I don't know. I can't fit this in my head. I just want to type some stuff.
Yeah. Which I think that's what I liked about this, the system at Deutsche Bank called Rail, because it allowed you to see all the complexity, to turn over the page, and then so the actual thing that you were visualizing often didn't have any configurability at all. It was just exactly as it should, and that's like in a book, the Edward Tufte, the visual representation of quantitative information, where you have spark lines and the introduction of things on printed pages which just show an infographic, which is not configurable at all, but it's just the information you need. Like in a newspaper, you have an infographic. Somebody's had to make a decision, made all the decisions for you, so you can grok that data with that. And there's no interactivity at all. There's nothing you can do as a reader reading a newspaper to change anything. So you have to hit everything. You have to hit a home run on all the things that you choose. You don't, and it's a laziness to offer the user all this configuration that they can do themselves. That's just kind of intellectually lazy.
Well, I think, like you said, with the Rails system, it's back to like the whole Brett Victor like ladder of abstraction thing, right? You have the thing of how it works, and then each step back, you peel back a little bit more complexity, maybe parameters, or maybe a little bit more, and then you have at the end very much like the code, right? But if the person that's operating it can see all those things, including the read-only output of what's going on, right, and they connect that to the code, like you have a very different world now, right? Because you're kind of expanding, not only expanding what they can do with it, but it kind of expands their understanding of the whole thing, right? Like, whoa, like I said, I don't need to open a Jira ticket to change this parameter to a float or whatever, add a decimal. They can say, oh, it looks like it's here, and then before they know it, they're programming, even though they're just tweaking things, right, on the undersides of an artifact, right? And I think
I would say programming should be that thing, and we should expand the definition of programming to mean what a user does in order to get a different result, or what a user can do digitally to solve their problems, to change something. Programming should just be about, we have the word configuration and we have the word coding and thing, and then really it's there are very grey lines between all these things. If you're a Lisp programmer, everything's this data and code, and so we get that thing that everything is a grey area, but really I'm saying that the grey area should extend right up into the user domain, and so the users are programming, but we call them power users. That's another distinction. Well, I'll actually just call them users, and have users be able to change the system, like the spreadsheet, like the anyone who enters a function into a cell on the spreadsheet is kind of a programmer.
Yeah, because they're always going to know the subject matter better than you, right? So who better to write the artifacts than them? And how do we empower them to do that? Because otherwise you end up with functional requirements going back and forth, and neither is speaking the correct language to each other, and you end up with something that's not as good.
Yeah. Well, I did want to get in there, to sort of defend Agile because I kind of beat up on it earlier. But the only context that Agile actually works is when the subject matter expert is programming through the developers that are in the room. That they're saying, "Oh, let's try this." And there are some situations in early Agile where they called it on-site customer, and the customer would say, "Let's try that." The subject matter expert would say, they wouldn't be raising Jira tickets, but that constraint is too strong a constraint in software development, because too often user communities and developer communities are spread far apart in space-time. They could be in different offices, different regions of the world, or they could be in different on a temporal axis. They could be, many years apart from each other, and so they're very, very rarely all in the same room, and therefore the constraint that Agile works well in is very often violated, and therefore Agile is just a very strong. It's a local maxima for very strict local conditions, and what we actually need is better technology, better programming languages, and in order to break that constraint. So we don't need Agile. We don't need that kind of constraint of everybody being in the same room and then being able to say, let's try this, try that quick interactivity. Because if you're on the temporal axis, if your development team have all left and gone to different projects, then the whole thing breaks. That's one thing that can happen that breaks Agile, is that the developers go to different projects. And so, we see in every, even post-Agile, in every large government IT project, see huge spiraling costs, vast costs. And so we know we haven't cracked it as an industry. We what we don't see very often are these things like Rabbit, these kind of user interactive programmable environments. And I bet actually that these things are far, far cheaper. Ultimately, the total cost of ownership of all these things this is where we need to be tapping, trying to be innovating in this space, and not kind of getting AI to be the team of developers that are code generating terabytes of code for us all the time. Because if the AI is generating in a very static paradigm, then we are just going to be compounding this problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an interesting parallel. So you said like the greatest thing to have would be to have the subject matter experts work in tandem with the engineers, and they brainstorm ideas back and forth to get the right thing. But the funny thing about that is you have to have the right engineers too, that will kind of understand, to use another metaphor, like, the letter of the law versus like the spirit of the law, right? Like, because like an orchestral player, right? Like there's a weird saying where if like, there's fly shit all over the page, like they'll play it. You know what I mean? Like they'll play what's there. And in some ways, AI is the same thing, right? If you don't tell it what to do, like it will play the fly shit that you put on the page, just like the engineer that doesn't look beyond the second step, right? So to make great things, like you have to have both those things, right? The person who knows how the business works, and then the engineers that are understanding of that and can work with them and like understand like what we're trying to build, not just, hey, he told me to build a button that said X on it, so here's your X button. Like, okay, but it kind of misses the point, Again, not to bag on software developers, but like this kind of like disconnect I see in the real world, like IT and dev shops. I'm sure you guys do so much that everyone has their own little sphere of concerns, and it just the Venn diagram for that kind of stuff is not quite there.
I think disconnect is a great word for this, because it means everywhere you need a connect, you're going to get a disconnect. You get a disconnect between the subject matter expert and the developer. I was going to make the same point about the disconnect between, in the old days, OLTP, and you mentioned OLAP, Ryan. This idea that, you have one model for operational databases, and that's cool because you've got transactional and fast moving, and then you need a completely different snowflake schema, OLAP, right? And then right, and now we're going to have an an ELT process, and everything we have in the data warehouse is only as live as its latest update, and that's a disconnect. Those are, whenever you've got two things, that's more complex than one thing, right? That's really what complex means, right? Having two things, and that's that's kind of, whenever there's two things, you should always ask a question: can we have one thing back? One. Can we get to one thing? And I just sort of feel we shouldn't try to optimize the interaction between users and developers. Perhaps we should just try to make it possible for users to do everything. Make everything simpler enough to where the users can do everything. Like the OLAP story is great, because I did OLAP for a number of years as a SQL Server consultant, and
I thought it was great because it, compared to the at that time, right, the transactional stuff we had was just so slow, and OLAP was just so fast with the cubes. But then it's like I added a whole new thing on top of the things, right? Now I'm writing MDX queries and I'm waiting 2 hours for the cubes to build. It's like we've just added problems on top of problems, right? We get something really cool out of it. But so it's interesting. Like I was kind of sad when OLAP kind of became not a thing, but it's more like with the columnar databases, I guess it's kind of built in these days more so than the, bespoke cube creation. But yeah, it's a great example of getting a 10% increase, but you're adding like 30% more complication. It's a whole new pipeline, a whole new DSL. Like, it's like, yeah, is that really the solution? Like maybe not,
Yeah, I mean, we're trying with columns and some of the design in XT is we're trying to get some of the advantages of OLAP, like the ability to, even the immutable format and the separation of storage compute is what sort of, when you have an OLAP cube, you know that you're just hitting one snapshot of a database, so you don't have to worry about transactions and immutability. And Clojure gives us a similar kind of, it's just a different approach, but gets the same outcome.
It goes back to the simplicity thing, right? It's like, what is the best implementation of OLAP is just a regular group by statement, right? That gets implicitly run as some type of OLAP thing so the user gets it quickly, right? Because user doesn't care. It's just, are we breaking that barrier kind of thing? And databases have gotten a lot better at that. But I also think that you guys are in an interesting position, like you said, with the immutability and Clojure, and with kind of going down the SQL route, where a lot of your peers have doubled down on the data log kind of thing. And I said this to Jeremy a couple weeks ago, like that could be huge, because you get to the normal the SQL normies. Like, no offense to those cats, I've worked with them forever, like, and I am still one to some extent, but you to literally, you're speaking their language. Hey, you can do it in SQL and do this. Then it's like, and then all of a sudden the game changes, right? Because everyone else is being like, hey, well, you can put it over here and you had to write in this DSL and maybe we'll make you like a SQL-like language. It's like, no, they just want to write SQL. And when you unlock
SQL becomes the data access protocol, and it is the light bulb holder that allows people to plug in light bulbs, and that's
as flawed as it is. It is. Yeah, it is the tent pole holding up so many things. No matter how many times they reinvent it, it's not going anywhere.
It's the reason why we're having this conversation, because it's the reason why Rabbit works with XDDB, because we never planned it, around Rabbit, and you never planned Rabbit around XDDB, but it's the reason we're having this conversation today.
Oh, dude! When I found out that the Postgres wire, sorry, Jeremy. When I found out, I was like, oh shit, that's going to be interesting, because it just adds so many things. And me building stuff in Clojure, it's like, oh, so I can do SQL stuff and have a key value store and speaks Eden. Like, oh, okay, that's again, I'm an edge case, right, compared to your customers, but it's like, okay, like someone who understands all those things is like, oh, okay, this is a new ball game now.
Yeah, well, I think the disconnect, if there is one that we're really trying to solve, is the disconnect when business and the developers are talking about timestamps. All right. So classically, when people talk about snapshots of databases, they're always talking about the system timestamp. And what the business cares about is the business timestamps. And of course, business timestamps are always delayed, they're out of order. And that's what the bitemporality gives you, is the way to a model for reasoning about that. But yeah, Ryan, really curious to hear how you've conceptualized bitemporality, because I don't know if you really spent a huge amount of time with XT before integrating with Rabbit, which you did within like a week. It was really crazy how quickly you got that working. But it'd be interesting to hear how you've seen these problems appear previously in your dashboarding world, where people were like, the dashboard changed, like not the layout, but I mean like the data in the dashboard's changed. I need to like go back to how it was. Someone made a decision at a point in time, and you need to understand what that person may have seen in order to inform that decision. Like, how do those problems actually play out in reality, and how do you think XT could help in that space?
Well, in most scenarios, you don't, right? I mean, like you can go back in some place, like, for example, like a place like Facebook, right? Like, they use lots of Presto and basically, every day, the entire tape, they just regular snapshot thing, right? Snapshot partitioning, just replace just copy the whole thing every day, and we'll just store, petabytes of data, which works, right? But makes things a little more complicated. And it's not quite as nuanced as what you guys do, and certainly not as performant. But I think there's something more interesting though, that kind of, and this is kind of like on left field from your question, is that I see it in two ways, right? I see it like I love the ability to have data, and then the data is mutated, and you have, like I said, you have the two axes. You have like the valid time, the business time, and then you have the actual change time, and it gives you a lot of options in order to go back and scrub through time and see what was different. But I'm also thinking that, well, I'm going to start storing, again, this is just me, I'm going to start storing actual artifact code in it as well, because not only do I want to see what the data looked like 2 weeks ago in this dashboard, but I want to see what the dashboard from 2 weeks ago would look like with today's data, and there's a lot of different things there. And that kind of flexibility to be able to say that is super big in talking about, like, hey, let's say you're at a regular company, you get a ticket in, they want to change this, they want to see this XYZ, and you could say, oh yeah, source control does that, but like it goes way beyond source control, because it's dynamic, and you can instantly fork old versions, and in this kind of model. But so I kind of see it as like a time travel primitive, right? And I mentioned earlier, being a data warehouse builder and engineer, in terms of like the changing dimensions and all of that stuff, and all the BS that we built up over the years to deal with this very problem, right? And a lot of times it involves a whole lot of unpacking and unrolling, and you have to know, oh, what this timestamp, and then he timestamped this there, and then there's a transaction table we gotta rerun and see what it was, and like, was this doable before? It was, but you had to build an incredible amount of scaffolding to make it happen, generally. And a lot of us did. We had the slowly changing dimensions, and the fact tables that get disabled facts, and then having to reconstruct things. And it just creates so much more of a complexity headache to your model, that. And then on top of that, you're storing way too much stuff, like I said, in the Facebook thing, or like, the partitioning thing, you're storing way, your denormalized table that you're putting in every day. That's great, because I have access to everything, but it's also like, that creates all kinds of other engineering problems, right? Which is why, Hadoop and all that stuff was created to solve the problems that, let's just save everything got to. And we're kind of in like the post data warehouse world to a certain extent now, at least. But people probably get mad at me for saying that, but it's kind of like, I think the whole star schema thing, a lot of that is nowhere near as effective as it was, let's say, 15 years ago. Given the way databases operate and how fast they are for normalizing stuff. I think. I think it's huge. Like I said earlier, the as was, as is argument, I think with a system like this is over, because as a guy who does dashboards and metrics, that comes up so much. When I was at Airbnb, that came up constantly, but it was hard to do because they would materialize all their metrics using Python. So it's kind of like has to be written into the description of the metric, yada, yada, yada. It's very hard to say when this was calculated. And if they change a great use case that I think you guys bring up on your site, if I change the definition of a metric, right? Usually you would have to like go and do a backfill or whatever. Like in this case, we could just say, well, this is how it was with this version. That was with this version. You know what I mean? Like there's so much more like flexibility there with stuff that, you never want to hear as is, as was again. You just want to say, as of when, just, click the button. Or do the thing.
Exactly. And we talk about, the data access protocol in SQL, but actually that something I didn't really grok to begin with, that the time coordinates, the programmability of time is there in the protocol with XD, at least version 2. It's not just a as of and a fast snapshot feature. It's this ability to say, as what would the dashboard look like with 2 weeks ago with today's data? What would happen if we had Black Friday customer footfall, but we had last August stock levels, or what would happen if we had this market data but last Friday's trades and so on. And there's so many times you want to kind of go dig deep and play around with different levers and sliders in order to kind of ask questions. And that's what SQL is. It's a way of asking the data questions. But this is just giving one little more lever to each one of your tables, which means you kind of don't have to think about it up front.
That actually makes me think of something super interesting. It's like, so dashboards, in the past are more of like a general overarching view. You want to find out what sales is, and it's understood that the dashboard's going to change every day, and this is how it is now, right? So it has to be made a little bit general. I can see in a world like this where I make a dashboard that's asking a very, very specific question and problem, and then we take that view and then we put it on top of whatever time we want to get different views of things, where in the past you really wouldn't build a dashboard like that because it doesn't make any sense. But like you said, you have a Black Friday dashboard that looks at things in a very specific way because that's a very different seasonality kind of thing, right? But then what if we were to take that calculations of that and put it on Easter or St. Patrick's Day? I mean, dumb examples, but you know what I mean? Like, I have a very specific, if you call a dashboard like a calculated view, right? And you put that lens on top of different points in time, like, I think you could come up with something. I think you could create insights that would be very much opaque to a regular system where you'd have to write that kind of bespoke, right? Like, I see it as like the view, the dashboard and the queries is just a view on top of like microfilm that's sliding, and that's time, right? That's the time through our database. And this is the lens that we see our world, but we can control time by turning the knobs. Like, I think there's a whole lot that can be pulled out of that if people kind of grok that kind of view of the world, right? Very cool stuff.
Yeah, that's right. Sometimes when you look at a chart, you kind of don't know, like if I used to get called into support issues in banks, and I would only be called when the system was in chaos. So I didn't know what normal looked like, you know. And it says, "Oh, this log file is so big. Well, why? What is it normally like? When you read a stat like 40,000 dolphins have died in the world oceans this year, that doesn't mean anything to me. If you told me that it was normally 5,000,
how many dolphins do we have?
And then it's going to be, wow, that's really big news. But if it's normally kind of 100,000, you're going to think that's really great. You've got no idea whether 40,000 is a big number or a low number. And so, unless you have the context of time, a lot of data is meaningless.
Yep, that's the key word, right? Is context, and that's kind of like you saw the videos of my rabbit stuff, like. There's so much going on, but like my aim is always to, like, if I can give the user as much context as possible for this thing that they're doing, maybe they can make a better decision. I kind of went from data to UI there, but you know what I mean? It's the same kind of thing. It's like, in a single view, what are all the things that I need to care about? And sometimes I go overboard and there's way too much stuff there. But at the same time, it's like, okay, what is the data type? What is the min max? What is the average value? Like, you're making a decision, and maybe you can make a better one if I answer questions for you before you ask them, because you ask them and it creates a, you know what I mean? It's like a whole feedback loop kind of thing. We want to make that the feedback loops as quick and as tight as possible. So,
well, I was literally just giving a talk yesterday on this idea of making the feedback loop tight, and by having your application database be the thing that you also run the analytics on. Nice. You can make that really tight, and I hope XC can do that under the hood. And it sounds like Rabbit's like a perfect UI solution for surfacing that kind of rapid feedback. But yeah, I feel like we better close up the episode, unfortunately. Ryan, if you had any parting thoughts, I know you're available for contracting, right? You're able to work with anyone on Rabbit. We haven't mentioned as well, it's open source currently, right? So people aren't getting locked into your secret proprietary dashboarding system, but you're presumably happy to hear from people about it.
Proprietary XML format. No, I'm just kidding. It's open source, and pushing a big update real soon. I don't know when this will come out, but probably by the time you see this, the GitHub page will have a whole bunch of different stuff on it. It'll be a lot more accessible to people. Like, I'm trying to keep the expert world over here and keep the no code, low code people here, but allow them to meet in the middle, right? That's kind of like my thesis there. And sneak Clojure in there so they can learn Clojure too, even if they don't know it. But yeah, so rvbbit.com is the blog. You'll find the GitHub link there. I'm Ryrobes on Twitter, or X, Twix, whatever you want to call it. Feel free to pester me there. It's a pleasure talking to you guys. And I'm just trying to. I want Clojure to have, like, no offense to Metabase and other places, but I want Clojure to have like a first class data viz platform to the likes of like Superset. You know what I mean? Because superset is great. It did a lot for Python. It did a lot for data stuff in Python. I want us to have something. And there's other good stuff going on, like Clojure, but those guys are on their own path. I'm over here on this other path, right? But maybe we can meet in the middle in the end. But I want to have that kind of thing, but 100% Clojure out there that people can use, and then they get into Clojure because of this. That would be a dream, Get my data people, my SQL people into parens. Hickified.
Awesome. Well, we'll definitely be there waving your flag, and look forward to more collaboration in the new year. I think we've got some more demos cooking up, which awesome. We'll have to touch base on soon. But thank you very much, Ryan, and thanks for listening.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks again, and nice meeting you, Malcolm.
You too, Ryan. Thanks so much.